The little-known 358 Winchester. This is a cartridge of unrealized desires, or it's the 308 Winchester on steroids. Hello everyone, Ron Spomer here with a cartridge that many of us have not heard of, never fired, never hunted with, and probably never will, but we might want to reconsider. The 358 Winchester is merely the 308 Winchester necked up to 35 caliber. And that might be half of its problem, if not more. It's really superior to the 308 in many ways, and yet, after it came out in 1955, it was met with a whole bunch of yawns. People just didn't seem to want it, even though they'd asked for it. And that's kind of a problem with all the 35s and the 33s. Any caliber in the US of A that exceeds 30 just never seems to do well, even if it's a highly efficient short action like this one. Now, to fully understand where we're going with all of this, we've got to go way back. Back in the good old days, hunting cartridges were dependent on big, heavy bullets because of the velocity constraints of black powder. So back in the, for instance, buffalo hunting days, they used big, heavy 500 grain bullets at velocities of somewhere between 1,500 and maybe 2,000 feet per second. They needed a lot of black powder in big cases to drive those. When they've discovered smokeless powder and its higher energies, plus bottlenecked cartridge necking down to have a narrower bullet so you could drive it faster, hunters didn't fully understand or appreciate the value of velocity. Because if you double a projectile's weight, you double its energy. Wonderful. That's why they were using those big, heavy bullets. But if you double its velocity, you quadruple its energy. And that is the value of modern high-velocity bullets. So what folks gradually began to appreciate this, the older guys kind of faded away and the younger guys coming up were more eager to adopt the new stuff. It's kind of standard procedure. They were trying those and having really excellent success with it. But there were still some holdovers. So gradually our diameters of bullets shrunk from 50 to 45 to 35 to 33 to 30, down into the 7s and even the 6.5s, although those were a lot more popular over in Europe than they ever were here in the early days. But still, we were coming around, and the 30-06 really helped swing the attention back to the smaller calibers. 30 caliber kind of became the all-American standard because of that. And of course, the 30-30 helped a lot, and that arrived before the 30-06. So the 30s cemented themselves as the deer hunting cartridge, and they could pretty much handle elk and moose and even some of the bigger bears. That became the standard. However, there were still plenty of folks that wanted a bigger bullet and a wider bullet. A lot of hunters still think that a wider bullet makes a bigger hole, so it must be more effective at terminating the animal. And it makes a certain amount of sense, except for, of course, the performance of the bullet once it lands. Expansion, mushrooming, and all that. That's critically important, and it can change a lot. You can make a 30 caliber bullet perform more like a 40 or 45 caliber bullet with the right expansion. Then the counter argument is you can do the same thing with a larger diameter bullet, but of course you have to also drive it fast enough to get that maximum expansion. So somewhere in there, they were designing cartridges that would offer a little bit of both. And in 1936, Winchester came up with a grand idea of the 348 Winchester, chambered in the only rifle that I think was ever chambered for this, was the Model 71 lever action. And that was merely the 1886 lever action Winchester. It was upgraded slightly and made really slick. And it was revered as sort of the ultimate tubular-fed magazine lever action rifle from Winchester. But didn't have huge sales because it was quite expensive, and not a lot of folks really did want that 348. Now this was a true .348 inch diameter bullet, not a 358 misnamed like so many are. But it was assumed to be sort of your best option for a woods lever action hunting rifle for elk. Everyone loved the 30-30s in the woods and a lever action for deer. The elk hunters wanted a little more power. That was the idea behind the 348. That was on the market until 1955. And that suggests something's going to be happening with the 308 Winchester. And what would that be? Well, the 308 Winchester came out in 1952. By 1955, of course, the wildcatters had played around with it and come up with a 35 caliber version. Winchester decided there were so many folks who wanted that bigger bullet for elk in the woods, and this was capable of outperforming the 348. So they necked the 308 up to 35, put a .35 8-inch diameter bullet on it, 200 grains, 225 grains, 250 grains. Bingo, guys, there is your close cover elk cartridge. And they put it in the new, fully modern stacked magazine, not tubular magazine, in the Model 88 lever action rifle. That was Winchester's idea of the fully modernized rifle, following the hints given strongly by the Savage 99. That particular lever action was way ahead of its time. And Winchester thought, we're going to probably make this move too. Much as the standard tubular feed Model 94s and 86s and all the good lever action rifles that they had, as popular as they were, they knew they needed to move into the 20th century with sharply tipped bullets in the stacked vertical magazine rifles. And that's why they came out with the Model 88. Unfortunately, it was not as beloved as the Savage 99. It never just didn't seem to take off. More hunters, I think, in those days after World War II in the 50s were swinging over to the bolt action rifles and pointed bullets and all the rest of it. And the ones who wanted to stay in the timber were just doing fine with their 30-30 lever action. So not a big demand for the 35s, but Winchester thought there certainly could be. So when they did some tests, I think they figured out what we're going to discover here really quickly with our ballistic tables is that this little short action 358 with less powder than the 348 would outperform that 348. The question is, will it outperform the 308 Winchester? And if it does so, why isn't it more popular? We're going to find out right now with the tail of the tape. So we've got our 308 Winchester shooting a 180 grain bullet because that's usually the heaviest bullet anyone wants to shoot in it. You can find a very few 200 grain loads on the commercial market. And of course you can load your own and get pretty good energy out of that bullet. You sacrifice your trajectory, of course, and your long range reach. But since most people are probably going to be working with a 180 grain bullet for what we would consider a heavy bullet in the 308, that's what I'm working with here. I did look for one that had a high ballistics coefficient. It's the Nosler AccuBond, BC of .507. Was able to launch that at 2,600 feet per second. You might get a little more or a little bit less out of it. The muzzle energy then is 2,702 foot-pounds. Recoil is going to be 18 foot-pounds, not too bad. And your maximum point-blank range for a 6-inch target is 260 yards. Now let's compare that to the big brother. Well, actually, it's the son of the 308 because the 308 is a parent here, not the big guy. I guess 308 had a genetically improved edition come out just a few years later. The 358 Winchester will be shooting a 225 grain bullet, kind of a compromise. Your 200 grain, I think, might be a better one to put up against the 180, considering the difference in the caliber of these bullets. You remember, the wider you go, the less your BC is, unless you really elongate that bullet, which in this case, you would probably want a 250 grain bullet. But then you've got pretty small powder capacity for driving that big 250. So the compromise for optimum performance, I think, is the 225 grain. I went again with the AccuBond. The BC on this one is not as high as on the 308, but it's pretty decent at .430. The velocity is not going to be as high because you're pushing a lot more weight. 2,550 foot-pounds, or feet per second. Got Covey barking over here. I think she wants to get in on this show. 2,550 feet per second. And that's not too bad for a rifle that you're primarily going to use in the woods and inside of 200 yards. Muzzle energy, pretty impressive, 3,249. Wow, we're looking at a good 5,000 or 500 foot-pounds more energy out of the 35. And that's pretty much what Winchester was driving at with this cartridge. Guys who wanted more punch. This one delivers it. You're going to get a little more recoil, 24 foot-pounds on your shoulder, and your maximum point-blank range drops down to 251. So you're giving up 9 yards. Not bad. So what all happens? Well, at 300 yards, you can see the numbers are pretty darn close. 3 inches high, and you're going to have about 0.7 to 0.9 inches of deflection in the wind, nothing really serious. But look where your energies are going. You're down to 2357 out of the 308, 2761 already out of the 358, out to 300 yards, which is really a little farther than either one of these should be applied. But you've still got plenty of energy for deer in the 308 with 1,171 foot-pounds, and more than enough even for elk out of that 358. I mean, 1,957 foot-pounds. You've almost up there at that 2,000 foot-pound range, which a lot of folks like for elk, although kind of the standard is 1,500, so you're still well above that. That tells you that that little 358 really is a potent elk round. Out to 300 yards, there's really not a lot of us who are shooting our elk farther away than generally 250 in the Rocky Mountain woods anyway, in the forest country that we hunt. 300-yard shot, you can reach across a lot of canyons with that. And of course, if you know your ballistics and your trajectories and all, you can extend that probably to 400 yards. I didn't put a 400-yard number in here, but I did take it out to 600 yards, which is going to be too far, but that really tells us what the potential is of both of these cartridges. So at 600 yards, you're getting a lot of drop out of that 308 with a 180 grain bullet, 84 inches. That's a lot to compensate for. 30 inches of wind deflection. Of course, that's your standard 10 mile an hour right angle wind, but you're still hanging on to 1,116 foot-pounds of energy. Plenty for mule deer. I don't think it's going to bounce off of an elk, but a lot of guys would like more. Well, you're going to get just a little bit more out of the 358. Look at those numbers. 1,122 foot-pounds. What happened to all that energy advantage? Well, it was sacrificed to the lower BC of that wider bullet. BC matters, guys. So as you might see from these numbers, it suggests, again, that 358 Winchester, surprising performance for elk and moose or any of the bigger animals out to 300 yards. And I wouldn't have guessed that if someone would just held this thing up beside the 308 and said, which one do you think would be better at distance? I would have gone 308. But really, your energy is hanging right in there, and the drops and drifts are not that far off either. So I think it's a good option for pretty much what Winchester intended in the first place. Now, I didn't run the numbers on this 348 because it falls behind the 358 as well as the 308. But I did throw in a 4570 government cartridge because so many people think of that when they think of a big lever action. That one, I threw a 300 grain flat point bullet because that's kind of the standard in factory ammunition. Anyone who really knows the 4570 knows that you can load it up for the stronger rifles like the 86 Winchester, the 95 lever action Marlin. If you got a big, strong, modern action like that, you can push it about 200 feet per second faster, get a little more energy out of it. But again, I went with the factory numbers here on the factory ammunition because they load things down to what essentially the 4570 was originally when it came out in 1873. So we're launching the bullet at 1900 feet per second. It has a very low BC of 0.197. That's going to hurt it. But of course, the 4570 is famous for its energy, and you've got a muzzle energy of 2,405 foot-pounds. Sounds like quite a bit, but look, it's already behind a 308 Winchester. Everybody thinks that 45 is so powerful. Less muzzle energy than the 180 grain bullet out of a 308 Winchester. So what happens with that one? Well, at 100 yards, it's already well behind the other two. And at 300 yards, it's really a dog. You're under 1,000 foot-pounds of retained energy, just 771 foot-pounds out of that 4570. And a lot more drop. 39 inches of drop compared to 8.5 for the 358. No contest here, folks. Forget it at 600 yards, which is a little surprising because the 4570 is known as kind of a bison market hunting round that the old market hunters would use and shoot at significant distances, 300, 400, 500, maybe even 600 yards to take bison, huge animals. And yet, look at the dismal energy at 600 yards, just 450 foot-pounds of energy. Was that enough to take a bison? Apparently was, because they reported from back in the 1870s they were doing it. So that tells you the 358 in a much smaller package with less recoil or similar recoil to 4570 is going to do a better job. And in many regards, it does a better job than the 308 Winchester. So why isn't it more popular? I think, really the absolute for me is just the fact that it's just 35. Our hunters in America just don't tumble to the 35s all that much. So given those numbers, given the fact that the 358 Winchester is more powerful and effective at range than the 45-70, why didn't it thrive? Why did it sort of die on the vine? I think it comes back to that 35 caliber. Once again, American hunters for deer and elk will settle for the 30 as their big caliber, and then they'll push the velocities by going from a 30-06 to a 300 Win Mag, 300 Weatherby Mag, any of the new 300 Magnums, including the massive 3378 Weatherby Magnum, because those long bullets have a higher BC, you're driving them faster, and they seem to kill just as effectively as a slightly slower, heavier bullet. But nonetheless, if you are a believer in your wider bullets and your heavier bullets at a lower velocity, the 358 Winchester is really one to consider. Anyone who's enamored of the mystique of that old 348 should really look at the 358. You can get it in the short actions, same as the 308, and it's quite efficient, doesn't burn all that much powder, does a heck of a job, and it's a surpriser, but boy, it's hard to find. I hunted with it down in Texas once on a feral hog hunt, did wonderfully. And even took a coyote with it running away, and I was really impressed with that bullet performance. It put things down and put them down handily. So if you ever come across one, there are some Browning BLR lever action rifles chambered for it. I think they still do that. There may have been some Savage 99 chambered for it in the day, of course the old Model 88 if you can find it. And Ruger was chambering it in some of their bold actions. You might be able to find one of those. It's a cartridge worth looking at. If you like bigger bullets in short actions, the 358 isn't a bad one to pick. Hey, this is Ron Spomer. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Honest and Shoot Straight.